How many of you, as you were listening to that gospel, were thinking, well, I'm never going to be able to do that? I mean, turn the other cheek, resist evildoer. Do not resist evildoers. If someone begs from you, give to them, everyone who begs from you. And then the really hard one, love your enemies. Then it gets to the end and it says, be perfect. It was like, no wonder. No, who can be perfect? Well, I think the word perfection or perfect gets translated poorly from the Greek. The Greek word that gets translated perfect is teleos, which is also the word that Paul uses when he talks about being a mature person of faith, being a mature. So the teleos gets translated as fulfilling your purpose, coming to a culmination of your kind of journey. It's reaching a desired goal, in a sense. Another word that I think would be good, and I haven't read this in any of the translations, is whole, to become whole, in thought, in body, mind, and spirit. So wholeness is what Jesus is holding up for us as our kind of a goal in our lives. But of course, we can't be perfect. That's not what we're being asked to do. And so some of you may have even been thinking, well, why would I want to be perfect? I wouldn't fit in very well in this world. Or in the song, the hymn we just sang, blessed are the pure in heart. Even purity of heart is something that doesn't sound like it would get you very far in the world, does it? It might get you walked all over, like if you're giving away your cloak, if someone asks for your coat, or if you're turning the other cheek. You're not going to get very far in life. So why would we want to strive for that? Well, if this was a more fundamentalist church, I'd tell you, you better do it or you're going to go to hell. But that's not what we believe. We don't believe that. And in fact, sometimes that can become a problem. It's like we already feel pretty assured of our salvation in Jesus. We feel pretty much good about that. So why do we need to work on anything? Why do we need to perfect ourselves? We're already loved by God. It's the challenge of the liberal church. And I think, and I've said this before, that what we're being asked to do is we're being asked to change from the inside. And the passage that Clyde just read from Paul about building the temple within ourselves is what we're being asked to do. We're being asked to be open to transformation. Complete transformation from the inside, so that when we do get to heaven, we can stand it. I know that's not an idea that you hear from the pulpit very often, but when we get to heaven, we're going to be there with our enemies. We're going to be one body with the people who irritate us the most, the people who hurt our feelings, the people who ended up snubbing us, or the people that that cheated us at that time, one time, that we're going to be in heaven with all those people, and we're going to be one body with them. So if we don't start changing now, it's going to be really uncomfortable. And I was thinking this as we were getting ready to read the gospel, that maybe hell is the difference between what heaven is like and what my heart is like. The hell is that chasm between how loving and how forgiving I really am, and how what heaven is like, which is about forgiveness of everyone. And so I was looking for a good story to tell about forgiving enemies, and there are a lot of them online. I encourage you to look for them. There's some really great ones. Just Google stories about forgiving your enemies, and you'll get a bunch of websites with stories on them. But the one that I liked the most was on a blog called 6 Truths About Loving Your Enemies. And it tells this story about Corrie ten Boom that some of you may have heard of. She was a Dutch Christian who wrote a lot of books. And she was during the Nazi persecution in the Netherlands. She and her family hid Jews in their home and shielded them so that they wouldn't be captured by the Nazis. And they built a secret room up in the 3rd floor, right in her bedroom, actually. And they would put people in there. And eventually somebody from the Netherlands leaked it to the Nazis that they were doing this, and they were imprisoned themselves, sent to a concentration camp. And 2 of her family members died in the concentration camp. She was eventually released on a clerical error, so she did eventually get out, but not before she was subjected to abuse and torture and other mistreatment. And she tells the story of coming back in contact after the war with one of her prison guards. And she must have written to him, because you'll see in a minute, that and told him that God forgave him, that God had forgiven him for what he had done, and that she would like to meet him. And I think her intention was to try to forgive him in person. But she says that at that service in Munich, she saw him, the former SS man who had stood guard at the shower room door in the processing center at Ravensbrück. And in another site, they talk about how this particular guard was especially cruel. And she says he was the first of our actual jailers that I had seen since that time. And suddenly it was all there. The room full of mocking men, the heaps of clothing, Betsy's pain-blanched face. He came up to me as the church was emptying, beaming and bowing. "How grateful I am for your message, Fraulein," he said. "To think that, as you say, he has washed my sins away." His hand was thrust out to shake mine. And I, who had preached so often to the people in Bloemendale the need to forgive, kept my hand at my side. Even as the angry, vengeful thoughts boiled through me, I saw the sin of them. Jesus Christ had died for this man. Was I going to ask more? "Lord Jesus," I prayed, "forgive me and help me to forgive him." I tried to smile. I struggled to raise my hand. I could not. I felt nothing, not the slightest spark of warmth or charity. And so again, I breathed a silent prayer. "Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give me your forgiveness." As I took his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder along my arm and through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for this stranger that almost overwhelmed me. And so I discovered that it is not our forgiveness any more than our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on his. When he tells us to love our enemies, he gives, along with the command, the love itself. I love this story because it points out that it's not easy. And when I talk about forgiving your enemies, I always have somebody who comes up to me and says, "I'm sorry, but there is no way I'm going to forgive," and fill in the blank. And they usually tell a story of pretty horrifying proportions. Of having to forgive people who abused them or molested them or betrayed them. People that have been pretty mean to them. And the first thing I say is that it's not about making it okay what they did. It's not about condoning what that person did. It's not saying that it's okay and that this person is a good person. It's not that at all. It's about being released from the attachment that that person has and to our hearts and our souls and our minds. It's about letting that person live in your head rent-free, as I've heard it said. And we don't need that. We need to be free of those ties. And so it's not easy, and it's not about condoning what the other person did. And as Corrie ten Boom points out, it's not we who do the forgiving either. We have to have God's grace to do it. In the collect last week that we prayed that in our weakness, nothing good can happen without you, O God. That we cannot do anything that any of this that Jesus is calling us to do on our own. We must ask for forgiveness, or we must ask for grace. And so I think sometimes that Jesus sets the bar a little higher than we could possibly reach for that reason, to force us to connect with God, to force us to rely on God's grace. Last week was full of several things that we cannot possibly do on our own. And setting the bar higher than the law, Jesus was doing last week. And today, setting the bar higher than any one of us can do. There's no way we can do this on our own. So that we can't then rest on our own pride, our spiritual pride, that we've done this. We've done this thing. In Buddhism, there's a term called spiritual materialism, where you collect accomplishments. And Christians are guilty of that as well, of talking about the things that they've done, how wonderful they were to help that poor person, and we don't want to do that. We want to come in humility and say, I can't do anything without you. The other thing that this points out is that we are not expected to. What was I going to say here? That Jesus doesn't deny that we have enemies. We do have enemies. Jesus admits that. The enemies that we have very often are the people that have offended us. That the people that have, as I mentioned, sometimes really horrible abuses, but sometimes they're the little things that people do, where they'll say the wrong thing or not say the right thing, and they will end up hurting our feelings. And so often we end up cutting off that relationship because of that hurt. And so in that sense, they become our enemies. We talk about enemies in terms of people who have trespassed against us. And it's important to keep in mind that when we are talking about forgiving our enemies, that we're not asked to forgive monsters who never hurt us. We're not asked to be God's forgivers of all that is wrong with the world. We're only asked to forgive our enemies, the people who have trespassed against us. And often as I say that prayer, I think two things as I say the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's like, I hope God isn't going to use my standard of forgiveness for forgiving me, because that's not very forgiving sometimes. But the other thing I think is, I'm really angry at this person, but did they really trespass against me? Did they really harm me, other than my ego? And so we have to kind of take a look at that and look at our enemies. And also, Jesus doesn't tell us that we have to like our enemies. We don't have to buddy up with them and start hanging out, and although that's always nice too if you can do that, but we aren't required to do that. We're asked to let go of that connection that we have with them that is harming us. It's about being transformed. And so we must take the initiative to show love and leave the rest to God. And what I often tell people who have to forgive monsters who have abused them is that we have to start first with praying sometimes for the willingness to be willing. That we need to start where we are. We're taught in AA to pray for the people whom we resent. And the word resent is interesting. It comes from the Latin word which means to re-feel. You feel that feeling over and over. When you think of that person that you're angry at, that burning feeling starts again. And we're taught to pray for that person. Well, a friend of mine had to forgive his wife who had done some things to him as well as he had done to her, but he started by praying that she would find a cold spot in hell. That was the best he could do. But he was praying for her. So gradually, as he prayed for her, he gradually got a little bit more compassion and a little bit better, a little bit friendlier toward her. And eventually, he realized he had started to care for her. He started caring about what was going on in her life. And he could finally pray that she would have health, prosperity, and happiness. That's pretty powerful. And he said, and one day when my daughter graduated from college, I was able to sit down across the table from her and with my daughters on my side and have dinner with her. He said that was a miracle. Well, that's the kind of thing that happens when we are willing to be willing first. And then as we begin to pray for the person, we will find that we are more and more connected. And I have experienced this with people. One AA meeting I went to handed out resentment marbles. And the idea was to carry the marble in your pocket. And every time you thought of that person that you resented, that every time you felt the marble in your pocket, you would pray for that person that you resented. And it gradually got to the point where I would do that and then forgot why I had the marble in the first place. It was like, what was that all about anyway? It happens, and we are freed, and our the temple within us that Clyde read about, the temple within us is cleaned out, and we are ready to be closer to God, because that resentment that we have isn't shutting off the sunlight of the Spirit and keeping us from being close to God. Amen.